Hello everyone! I'm Quinn Buckland, author of books like The Engine That Runs the World, Fallen Gods, and Supernatural Pizza. And today, I'm doing something a little different. Normally on this channel I do reviews, but today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I'm going to be going over, and actually this is something that I'm going to be doing like a bunch of times from here on out. Instead of reviews, I'm pretty much going to be going over other people's work and pretty much expressing what I like and don't like about things. God damn it, I said I wasn't doing reviews anymore. Ugh. In all reality, what I'm actually doing is not doing reviews. It's way more in-depth, and specifically pointing out just a few different things. And today I am talking about Atlas Shrugged. That's right, Atlas Shrugged. The very book that people like to point to when talking about how toxic conservatives can be. And frankly, they're not really that wrong. But I'm not really here to talk about Ayn Rand's philosophies. That's not really something that I want to talk about. But before we get into anything, we have to ask ourselves, who is Ayn Rand? So to really know who Ayn Rand is, we need to have a little bit of a history lesson. So, she was born as Elisa Rosenbaum in 1905, just 12 years before the February Revolution. And yeah, basically she watched Russia go from being essentially a monarch to a communist state. And let's be honest here, that wasn't exactly a clean or good change for Russia. It kind of really tanked everything. Anybody who was anybody was starting to starve to death. She watched her own family struggle to even survive. So when she eventually moved to America, she kind of had this perception of communism or anything having to do with the left wing, and basically believed it to be evil. Anything that wasn't, according to her philosophy, was more or less just not a good thing. And coming from an understanding of, how she watched basically her entire country go to shit, and I'm not saying like that's the role of communism. I honestly think there's just a lot of things that happened, and some things happened way too fast for it to have actually been effective. But I'm not really gonna get into that because that's not what this video is about. Anyway, in 1925, she moved to America. She got a few jobs here and there, and eventually she ended up writing some books. Primarily, her early works were stuff like Anthem, We the Living, and eventually she went on to write The Fountainhead, and then Atlas Shrugged. And she created this whole philosophy called objectivism. It's something that I've seen misquoted and misrepresented a lot from people on the left and on the right. Basically, everyone seems to misinterpret what it is. And I myself, I'm not an expert on objectivism, but I see a lot of misrepresentations of what it is, and a lot of it tends to break down into live for yourself and not somebody else. Is that a good philosophy? It depends on the context, I suppose. But I'm not here to talk philosophy. I'm here to talk about this. So, we're moving on. We know who Ayn Rand is. We know why she believed what she believed. We're moving on. And we will be moving on to probably one of the biggest questions, and something that a lot of you may have already been asking. How did I come to read this? And I think that's a very fair question. It's a little bit of a story, but let's get into that. And for those of you asking why I'm going through all this, like who she is and my experience with Ayn Rand and her work, it's mostly just for context purposes. It's mostly just so you guys, as the viewers, know that, I have an idea as to what I'm talking about. I mean, yes, I was reading some of her history off Wikipedia just now, but whatever. It doesn't matter, right? I don't care that much about Ayn Rand as a person. But yes, I'm doing all this for the sake of context. Anyway, my history reading Ayn Rand's work. So, back in my early 20s, actually I think this might have even started in my late teens, I got into dystopian fiction. Primarily, like, I started off with, like, 1984 and Brave New World, which I absolutely loved. So I wanted to get my hands on more. So I got into We by Yevgeny Zamayatin. I got into, I think, a couple others that I can't remember. And eventually I got my hands on Anthem. And Anthem was one that I'd wanted to read beforehand anyway because, well, I'm a big fan of Rush. And the song 2112 is almost a recreation of the book Anthem. Just a little, but it's got some differing details. But for the most part, the contexts are more or less the same, which intrigued me. So I read it, greatly enjoyed it. It's actually really good, at least from what I remember of it. And from what I remember of it, it is pretty good and has a really, I'm not going to say a really great message, but a really cool story. And after experiencing that, I'm like, well, the hell else does Ayn Rand write? And I picked up The Fountainhead, and I loved it. I mean, I could have done without a lot of the philosophy stuff, and there are a few scenes that are a little very problematic that I'm not going to get into because I don't want to be. Actually, I'm not even monetized. Anyway, I'm just not going to get into that. So, The Fountainhead, loved it, and a lot of it was due to the message that I took from it, and that message was mostly, do your art for yourself. Don't compromise to what other people want it to be, because only you can do the art that you want to do. And that really resonated with me, and that resonates with me today. And frankly, I still love that message. Would I love the book as much now that I'm not in my early 20s? Probably not. I'd probably find a lot of flaws with some of what the character of Howard Rourke is saying. And I think that has a lot to do with with some of my also interpretations of Ayn Rand's philosophies, and that it's an exceptionally outdated philosophy. And the only way it could possibly work today is with some reinterpretations, and if it's being reinterpreted, it is not from Ayn Rand. So, Ayn Rand's philosophy in and of itself is very much outdated. Anyway, after reading The Fountainhead and loving it, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna read this Goliath mammoth of a fucking book, Atlas Shrugged. And I picked it up when I was on the rigs. And actually, I hadn't even started it by the time the first movie came out. There are movies of this. And I watched the first movie. And holy crap did I love it. Even now, I still actually really like that first movie. Because it just tells a really good story with some really strong characters. And frankly, that's really all a story needs for me to be intrigued, or at the very least interested, is some strong characters and a good story. Unfortunately, parts 2 and 3 tended to really drop the ball in terms of both acting and story. But I'll get into that in just a moment, because when I say that the movies follow the book about as well as they possibly can, I am also meaning in tone and theme. And yeah, it's not good. So, that's basically my... Oh, wait, no. I gotta talk about me trying to read this thing. So, the lettering in this is pretty small. It's just about 600,000 words, which is not a small number of words, obviously. So, I started reading it, and I got through the first part fairly quickly and easily. But that second part, I ended up putting it down and just not picking it back up again. And then I'm like, okay, I gotta read this. I gotta get through this. And I got through the second part and into the third part. And then I put it down and then just didn't pick it back up again. Until, I think it was probably 3 or 4 years later, where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna finish this book. I'm going to finish this book, and then it will be done. And I finished it. and I feel like I want a lot of that time back. Part 1, enjoyed it. Even as a book, it did a really good job of addressing its characters and its story and its atmosphere. Like, it did a pretty good job. Part 2, it was an acceptable continuation. I'm not going to have a whole lot of issues with it. Like, it definitely continued on with where Part 1 had ended. Part 3? Well, let's just explain the story in as much of a nutshell as I possibly can. This is a big book. It's going to take a lot of time. I apologize. But I'm going to pretty much just go over the stuff that's generally important to the story. Dear God, I'm almost 11 minutes in and I haven't even gotten into my issues with this fucking book. Okay, so Atlas Shrugged follows this woman named Dagny Taggart. She is the COO of Taggart Transcontinental, which is a train company. Her brother is the CEO. He runs it. Basically, Dagny essentially does all the actual work, and he takes all the credit and glory for it. But people are going missing. Primarily business owners and people who have a bit of a reputation for playing a little bit of hardball and essentially being strong business owners. The people who don't kowtow to the government, stuff like that. And yeah, they're going missing. Nobody knows why, but that's not really important to the book right now. Dagny is, well, essentially Taggart Transcontinental is failing. In fact, the entire country is failing piece by piece. And Dagny is trying to keep her company from going under. And she has a lot of sentimental value attached to this company because it was created by her grandfather and was passed down to her father and then to her brother. And, well, she just loves it. She's got a bit more of a business mind than her brother does and essentially just runs everything. She has this friend named Francisco D'Anconia, who is a master of business. He runs this copper mine company and is just fantastic at it. However, things seem to be going wrong with his company all of a sudden, and nobody can really figure out why. Dagny figures it out pretty quickly that D'Anconia is intentionally sabotaging his own company, but she can't figure out why exactly. I mean, it's pretty straightforward and obvious as you continue on in the story, but we'll get to that. Anyway, there's this train track, the Rio Norte line, that needs to be redone because it's basically breaking and falling apart everywhere. So Dagny orders these rails from this guy named Hank Reardon, who has created this style of steel that is super light, super durable, and is it's essentially indestructible in a lot of ways. So she orders these rails, but it's deemed untested metal by the state science committee, and it's basically the public are against it, and so is Dagny's brother. So he's like, no, I don't want this. And she's like, well, tough shit, we're doing this. And eventually the public outcry gets so bad that she has to more or less quit in a sort of way and fund the project herself. Anyway, the Rio Norte line gets created. She renames it to the John Galt line because all the while when everybody's going missing, they keep having messages like, who is John Galt? And this who is John Galt seems to be a running theme throughout. It's a running question throughout the entire book. And Dagny hates it because it essentially means giving up. And yeah, I mean, that is essentially what's going on there. So she wants to essentially spit in the face of whoever this John Galt guy is, or the question in and of itself, and create a successful railway line. So as predicted, the railway line is a success, and Dagny and Hank Reardon go and celebrate with this guy, Ellis White, who is an oil tycoon. Wyatt vanishes, they don't really think anything of it, and they go and check out this place called 20th Century Motors, because Dagny is running a little short on motors, and for trains, and Hank's like, well, maybe this place might have some parts. It's abandoned, it went under, because company politics, bullshit, so it went under, and they're like, cool. And they find this engine that is supposedly capable of running on atmospheric energy, which, honestly, even in the book and in the movie, that really piqued my interest, because I'm like, okay, there's a science fiction element to this now. I'm interested. So Dagny wants to go and find out who built this engine, and she goes through a list of names, and she goes through and talks to a whole bunch of people, and eventually she catches word that Ellis Weiss's entire oil foundry is on fire. She goes there, she finds the sign that says, "I quit, I'm on strike, don't try and find me, you won't, you can have it as I found it." And just this is where part 1 ends. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes on, like I obviously skipped over a lot of stuff, but that's just where part 1 ends. This book is really thick. So skip to a little while later. Hank and Dagny are in a relationship. Hank is, however, married. And yeah, that's not really the best thing, but they're having an affair. They're definitely in love. And you know what? Cool. I support these two crazy kids. But Hank's wife catches on. And she's like, yeah, I'm not going to divorce you for this. Like, that's... Because that would mean throwing away my life. But you're going to end up paying for this in some way. I'll figure out how eventually. And she does. She eventually ends up going to the State Science Institute and being like, hey, he's having an affair. You can use that against him. And Hank initially is like, yeah, no, fuck you. I don't care if you drag my name through the mud. And they're like, but what about Dagny's name? And he's like, shit. Well, okay, fine. You agree not to go after Dagny, then I will sign my medal over to you. And he does. And all this while, Dagny is trying to figure out who the hell built this engine so she can get this thing running and essentially rebuild the world. And eventually she learns that it was a guy named John Galt that built it. Big fucking shocker there, right? But I digress. She ends up figuring it out, and she ends up actually following him in an airplane and crashing to where John Galt and everybody who disappeared are hanging out. Dagny's injured. She spends some time there. She learns what's going on and why they're doing what they're doing, and essentially it breaks down to the government is controlling everything, and we want to give the control back to the business owners. Because the means of production and the means of all that stuff belong to the owners, the people who put in the blood, sweat, and tears to create everything. And yeah, okay. Whatever, I suppose. Personally, it's not a great philosophy. Like, I get the whole, if you create it, then essentially it's yours. Like, you own the patent for it, and yeah, that's fine, whatever. And the production, whatever. I'm going to continue on with the story. Anyway, you'd think that Dagny would want to stay in this place, because she understands what's going on and actually agrees with what they're doing. But no, she wants to go back and try and save her family railroad. For some reason that I still don't fully understand, she wants to go back and try and save the railroad, despite knowing that she'll be able to save the railroad after it all collapses. Yeah, whatever. She goes back, the same old bullshit goes on. She finds John Galt, she starts a relationship with him, because I guess Hank wasn't enough at that point. John Galt does a 3-hour speech, which equates to 50 pages of just straight talking. And John Galt eventually gets captured, they go in and save him, and the book ends. Seriously, the book just ends. Now, if parts 2 and 3 seemed very quick to you, that's because that's about how much story there was to it, or at least how much important story there was to it. Like, there's some character stuff in there, here and there, but a lot of that stuff was just more flavor than anything else. Flavor and a lot of philosophy. And dear God, the fucking amount of philosophy. This book could be a third of the size and still hold the same amount of story, just less of the philosophy. But now we get into the bit that we've all been waiting for. My issues with this book. And it breaks down into three certain things, into three different areas. And I'll get into that. Now, my issue, the first, a very, very weak third act. All major story really just kind of went out the window with this book in that third part. Like, essentially, what it came down to was Dagny loves John now. Philosophy. The government is bad. Philosophy. Oh, hey, Dagny's brother's wife killed herself because she realized that her husband was not the person she believed him to be. Philosophy. Short action scene, done. Yeah, that's essentially, like, I know what you, I can almost see your guys' faces. Like, this is essentially the same look I had reading that entire third act. Like, it's just not a good, strong act. Like, you want that third act to actually be something. The first act can be a little weak. It's got to be interesting enough to bring the reader in, but it can be the weakest part of the book. That third act needs to be the strongest part. It needs to be enough to hold the reader in and leave them satisfied. I was not satisfied at the end of Atlas Shrugged, and I think it is unreasonable for anybody to expect someone to be satisfied at the end of Atlas Shrugged. My issues, part 2. The failed, or I guess straight up just abandoned, romance between Dagny and Hank. John Galt, he is not the sort of character that I wanted Dagny to be with. Mostly because he is an emotionally distant, kind of abusive sort of character who cares more about his philosophy than any person that is actually in Galt's Gulch. He is just not a good person. And Dagny, I mean, while having some definite character issues, she was still the sort of main character that I could get behind. And you know who else was? Hank fucking Reardon. Hank, much like Dagny, he's got his flaws, sure. Sure. I mean, it's a little bit too much into the Ayn Rand philosophy. I mean, sure, whatever. But in terms of a relationship, the way he treated Dagny, my God, he is the sort of person that Ayn Rand should have continued the relationship with in terms of Dagny. Because the way that he sacrificed his own work to keep her name from being dragged through the mud. He sacrificed for her. Like, the fact that she just straight up abandoned that romance with nothing. Like, there wasn't even really a breakup in this book. She sees him later on, and Hank's like, yeah, I get it. I don't blame you. And I'm just like, that's it? That's it? That's all I get? Following this romance from part 1 all the way through part 2. For, yeah, I get it. I'm not mad. Oh, yeah, it actually kind of pisses me off even still to think about it, because it's just, really? My issue with Atlas Shrugged the last. The just huge tonal shift from being mostly story-based to focusing entirely on philosophy. That really irritated me, because I kind of got used to there being an actual story. Then all of a sudden, it's just philosophy with a little bit of story sprinkled in just to keep a narrative moving. That's really all there is. You know, Dagny's at Galt's Gulch, and it's philosophy from all these characters like Hugh Axton, Ragnar Daniskjöld, Ellis Wyatt. Oh god, what the hell was that other guy's name? Hugh Axton. It's just philosophy after philosophy after philosophy, and it's like, yeah, I fucking get it. I get it. I don't need any more of this. Then Dagny goes back, and we get a little bit of story. And then you get Galt's goddamn speech. And, oh god, when I say it's 50 pages, I mean it is 50 pages of writing like this. Like, it is tiny, tiny writing. He says he talks for 3 hours. I haven't had the guts to try and actually time how long it takes to read that, or to even say what is there out loud. I'm willing to bet it probably takes a little bit more than 3 hours. But the fact that the story is not only just put on a back burner, but almost abandoned from that point forward, with the exception of Galt being captured and a short rescue scene, that's really all Part 3 is. It's just almost straight philosophy. And, yeah, it really just kind of annoying. And when I say there's a short rescue scene and then it ends, I'm not joking. There's a short rescue scene and then it ends. There is no actual closing moment in this book. It just ends. And I hate that. I genuinely hate it. And you know what actually frustrates me the most about this whole thing? It could have worked. Like, yeah, it was still going to be a book full of Ayn Rand philosophy, like The Fountainhead and Anthem were, sure. And, you know, people in their early 20s, they're bound to be a little bit more suggestible to these sorts of things. Yeah, okay, sure, whatever. Moving on with that. But it had so much opportunity and so much potential to actually be something fantastic. And Ayn Rand was so focused on her philosophy at the end of this book that any actual possibility of making a good ending just went straight out the window. She wanted John Galt to be essentially the Ubermensch of her book. Well, he was, and he's the one who got the girl at the end, and he's the one who saves the world, and he's the one who does all this other stuff. And John Galt as a character is about as dry as a piece of wood. I don't like the character. I didn't like the character when, like, almost from the start. Like, he is essentially a male version of Ayn Rand's self-insert in a lot of ways, and it just doesn't work. So, yeah, I just hate that. And now for the part that I'm going to be putting at the end of all these videos. What can writers learn from Atlas Shrugged? Well, I can sum this up in one goddamn word. Commitment. Commit, 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 commit. If you're gonna do a romance story, commit to the romance. Don't change who she's into in the final act. Because you're gonna throw everything off, you're gonna make the original romance seem cheap, or the new one seem out of nowhere and pointless. Actually, you'll make the original one seem pointless as well, because commit to creating a good third act. Like, that should be fairly self-evident. And commit to your tone. Don't change what you're doing 2/3 of the way through the story, because you're going to give your audience tonal whiplash. If you want your story to go into a bit of a darker turn, build up to it. This isn't a movie. Like, in movies, it's a bit more of a visual medium. You can have those tonal whiplash moments and still have them work. They're very few and far between where they actually work, but you can do it. In a book, you actually do, in a book and as a story, you kind of really do need to work your reader into it. Because if you have a tonal whiplash moment, it's going to completely screw your reader up, and they're not going to know what the hell they got themselves into. You gotta have a little bit of build-up. It can still almost seem right out of nowhere, but if you have that little bit of build-up, your reader's still going to have an idea as to what to expect later on. Ayn Rand, while this book is definitely fairly philosophy heavy in both the first and the second acts, there's still more. It's still primarily story. You're still following Dagny and Hank as they're trying to survive and keep their businesses afloat, while the government and the country are collapsing around them. You know, it's at the very least an interesting story. But then the story just kind of gives up. And don't do that. As a writer, do not do that. Because you will irritate your reader. And you will get reactions like mine to this. Man, that feels good to have out of my system. So, in conclusion, Atlas Shrugged. Good book for the first little bit of it. Then it just really drops the ball. I think I made that abundantly clear by now. But, yeah. That's about all I got for you guys. So, be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jargon stuff. Check out my books. I can guarantee they're better than this. They don't sell as well as this, but they're better. They at least have satisfying endings and good stories with characters that are consistent all the way through. Yeah. See you guys. The intensity of my forehead.